So in every moral decision, there are kind of some key components. There's what we call the moral object. The moral object doesn't mean that the decision is moral, or to say it's a moral decision doesn't mean that it's automatically moral or good, but it's simply saying the object, the focal point, the action in question in a moral decision. So the moral object is ultimately what is being decided. What is the main question? What is ultimately the action that was done? If we're looking back at a situation, for instance, or if we're in the middle of the situation, what's the main decision we have to do? Then we have the intention. That's our motivation. So why did someone do that action, or why is someone thinking they're going to do this action? And then circumstances. These are all the facts, the who, what, where, when, how of a situation. So all the different factors surrounding that situation that we need to take into consideration. So here's a humorous example of Toy Story. Love that movie. On this screen, we see Mrs. Potato Head showing up with, "Sorry I'm late, my stupid husband forgot to pick up food, so I just threw something together," and we see a bowl of potato salad. Potato cannibalism. So here, if we look at this humorous situation, we think of, what's the object? Well, Mrs. Potato Head turning Mr. Potato Head into a salad. What's her intention? Well, she was going to this party and she wanted to bring something because her husband forgot to pick something up. She wanted to just throw something together. What are the different factors? Well, she's a potato, her husband's a potato, and her husband forgot to pick up food. So we might say those are facts about the situation. So what other things should we take into consideration? So we've established those things. What should we take into consideration? Well, there's alternatives. So this is what we could have done instead of the moral object. And consequences. So what can occur because of the moral object? So consequence, a lot of times we think of a negative frame of mind. Consequences can be positive or negative. They're simply the effects of a situation. So there could be positive effects. There could be negative effects. There can also be direct effects and indirect effects. So the direct effect of Mrs. Potato Head, making potato salad out of her husband is she killed her husband and she doesn't have a husband. The indirect effect could be that, well, everyone now thinks she's weird and doesn't want to be near her because of that. So alternatives. So instead of maybe chopping up Mr. Potato Head into a salad, Mrs. Potato Head could have gotten popcorn and ordered a pizza to the party so they could beat us there. Some possible consequences. I just named them before. She's a cannibal. She's kind of weird. She goes to potato jail. And yeah, don't do that, Mrs. Potato Head. So those are possible consequences. So ultimately, when we're making a moral decision, we have to weigh all these things. It's important to note that some moral objects are always immoral. It does not matter the intention, it does not matter the circumstances, it doesn't matter the alternatives. Some moral objects are just always immoral. Right? So there's really never a case where, for example, adultery is going to be justified. They weren't living up to what I thought they were going to be, so I cheated on them. I mean, in no instance is that going to be justifiable. Regardless of what someone else did, does not justify cheating on them with someone else. I mean, that's just one example. But so there are some objects that, regardless, just off the bat, are going to be immoral. Right? There's no other understanding of them. They're just, by their nature, they're immoral. However, there are others that, based on their circumstances, we might not necessarily say are immoral. So we might look at why someone did that. We have to look at what the situation was. We have to look at where there are alternatives that were better. What were the possible consequences? We have to look at everything we learned from last module. What would Jesus say about this? What do just laws say about this? Are there virtues or vices at play? Is this an example of a poorly informed conscience, of a good conscience? Are these good dictates at play? If not, it would be an immoral decision. If it is, it would be a moral decision. All right, so we may look at the controversial issue of killing. So murder is evil. Murder, by almost all intentions of the word, are unjustifiable and immoral. However, there is this sense, especially in the Catechism, that talks about the right to self-defense. So within reason, to reasonably defend oneself using force that is not greater than the force that someone is trying to defend themselves from. So in this regard, it might result in the end of a life that is not wanted nor desired, But in this case, we may not call it an immoral act out of the reasonableness of self-defense. Now, granted, there must be a lot more to that situation, circumstances, etc. One of the beauties of Catholic morality is it tries to take each instance as its own instance and try to understand that situation for what it is and what's at play to be able to apply these truths and these principles that guide our decision making. So we're going to look at a couple of general examples. Humor me, they're just scenarios for our practicing purposes. And then at the end, there's going to be one that you're going to be asked to do on your own for this week's module. So let's look at one general scenario. All right, so Georgia, or say, all right, so this person, Georgia's hands were sweating. She was 15 minutes into her math final when she began to panic. This exam was worth most of her grade in the class. She understood math, even liked it, and usually did really well. Her constant problem was that she wasn't a strong test taker. Now here she was, once again stuck on one problem worth 25 points on the test, and she was drawing a blank. She remembered doing a similar problem in class and explaining it to her friend Jessie, but now she was so stressed out by the test, she couldn't even remember how to begin the problem. She listened to the clock tick on the wall and imagined her parents' expression when she receives her report card. Jessie was sitting right in front of her. He's always a good test taker and had already solved the problem. The teacher had his back turned and was on the other side of the room. Georgia could look over Jessie's shoulder, get the answer, and no one would know. Georgia needed to think quickly. She thought about how unfair it was that she rarely does badly on tests even though she works so hard in class and understands the material too. She thought about how often she helped Jessie in class throughout the semester. What should she do? She prided herself on doing what was right, but how right is it that she has to work in a system that doesn't reward such hard work? Finally, she took a deep breath. She looked to see if the teacher was still on the other side of the room and glanced over Jessie's shoulder just long enough to get the final answer to the question. Then she figured out the rest of the problem on her own. In the moment, she felt great about her decision. She felt she had sort of created an ethical compromise. All right, so take a moment. You can pause this lecture if you want and try to figure out the situation on her own. What do you think is the moral object? What do you think is her intention? What are some different circumstances? Are there alternatives? Are there consequences? And ultimately, would you say it's moral or immoral? All right, you can do that right now. And then I'll go on to explain the results. So here's a way that we can understand the situation. So what's the moral object? So the action in question is Georgia taking Jessie's final answer. I looked over his shoulder and got his final answer. Why did she do it? Well, she wanted to complete the problem and do well on the test. All right, pretty simple. Circumstances. So what are at least three circumstances? So at that moment, the teacher wasn't looking. So Georgia was talking about how she's a bad test taker and how she's helped Jessie before in class. Excuse me. What are some possible alternatives? Well, instead of taking Jessie's final answer, she could have raised her hand. Maybe she could explain the teacher's situation, asked for help. Maybe she could have skipped the problem and come back to it later and see if there's other problems in the test that could help her, or if she remembered something. Perhaps if she knew that she was a bad test taker, she could have tried to handle that ahead of the test and spoken with the teacher, as opposed to always knowing she's a bad test taker and then trying to handle things last second. What are possible consequences? So in one way the teacher could turn around and she could get caught and get a 0 on the test, or the teacher could realize she cheated. Nothing could happen. All right, she could get away with it. Or Jessie could have gotten the wrong answer for the question, and so she's now left in a bad place and she gets it wrong too. So considering all this, what might we say? We would say ultimately we would consider this decision to be immoral. And the reason being is ultimately the object of taking an answer that didn't belong to her, is ultimately what we deem as cheating or stealing. It would be immoral. So even though she helped him throughout class and it would be frustrating, the idea is he produced that in and of himself on that test. She didn't create that answer, he did. So we might look at the command to not steal. We're also talking about ultimately being an honest and genuine person, that when we're trying to not give our genuine effort, we're not giving genuine work that's really ours and claiming other work ourselves. When I think of plagiarism, for instance, we're really being dishonest and not being genuine. And we want to work towards being genuine, as Jesus said, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. Unfortunately, a lot of times I think people will cheat because they don't really know what cheating is, or they don't know what they're doing is cheating. That if you're taking someone else's work and not giving them due credit, ultimately you're kind of stealing that work. So we're called to be honest and genuine, and to seek what's right. And if we know we struggle with that, to look at other alternatives, to what else could we have done differently? How else could we have prepared? How else could we have sought help from the teacher? And how can we build that communication with the teacher and with class or with school so we can better handle it? Maybe there's too much work, and so I can't handle it because too much work. Well, actually talking with the teacher, coming up with a different schedule for getting the work done, maybe amending the lesson. That's always something that I've always been willing to do and always will do, but there has to be communication in that regard as well. So let's look at one more situation together. So this situation about Maria and Pam. Maria was worried about her good friend Pam. Pam was always talking about how fat she was and what she was trying to do about it. But the truth is that Pam was not fat at all. In fact, she was downright skinny. Since their freshman year, Pam had lost at least 15 pounds. Now they were juniors and Maria was afraid that Pam had an eating disorder. Maria was also getting frustrated. Where were all the adults? Who was watching out for Pam besides Maria and her friends? Maria knew that someone from their school had talked to Pam's parents last year, and that Pam's mom had gotten angry about the school poking its nose into family business. Pam's mom claimed that Pam had a dancer's body and a high metabolism. That was last year. Now things were worse, and Maria felt like she was literally watching her friend disappear. Finally, one Monday afternoon, Maria had had enough. As she watched Pam take 3 diet pills and eat 4 grapes for lunch, she decided she had to do something. Pam would be furious if she found out that Maria had talked to someone behind her back. As helpless and scared as she felt now, Maria thought, how would it compare to how she would feel if Pam actually ended up in the hospital, or worse? So without telling Pam, Maria went to the school's guidance counselor and told her everything. All right, so you can take a moment. What is the moral object, intentions, circumstances? What are possible consequences, alternatives, and ultimately would you say it's moral or immoral? Take a second to do it. You can pause the lecture, and I'll head into what the answer would be. All right, so let's look at the answer to this scenario. So ultimately the object in question, the dilemma she's trying to figure out, her ultimate action, is that she told the school's guidance counselor about Pam. Right? That's the action ultimately in question. Why did she do it? Her intention? Well, to try to help Pam and avoid possibly a worse situation. What are some facts or circumstances about the situation? So facts. She knew that someone from the school had spoken to Pam's parents last year and they got angry over it. She knows that Pam is skinny and has lost an additional 15 pounds since freshman year. She also saw Pam take 3 diet pills and ate 4 grapes at lunch. So these are facts in this scenario. What are some possible consequences of her going to the school's guidance counselor? Well, Pam could possibly get help from the school. Another possible consequence is that Pam and her parents could reject help and condemn Maria and get mad at her like they did at the person from the school last year. What are some alternatives? What could she have done instead of going to the guidance counselor? Well, she could have gone to Pam directly, or she could just do nothing and leave it alone. So ultimately, based on what we've learned about morality, we might say that this ultimately our actions could be considered moral. So the act of going to tell the guidance counselor out of concern for a friend, we couldn't reasonably say is immoral. It might make certain people mad, but it wouldn't be immoral because what she is doing, she's looking out for her friend. She's depicting the golden rule, to treat others the way she'd want to be treated, to seek love and willing to good for another. And sometimes friendship is having those difficult conversations, not putting someone down or looking down or judging them by any means, but maybe being there, especially in those difficult situations, or at least making sure they can offer that help. So ultimately, we would say that the decision was moral. So this is going to be the scenario you're going to have to evaluate. So I'm going to ask you to kind of first write in the module a little bit summarizing how to make a moral decision and what we can base it off. And you're going to use some of the materials from last module to help you do that. And then to evaluate your own scenario, so at least know the skill set of identifying these different components of a moral object, an intention, a circumstance, alternatives, consequences, and ultimately if it's moral or immoral. It would ultimately be one or the other, seeking truth. Okay. So this is going to be a story about Sarah. So I'm going to ask you to read this scenario on your own, and then to complete the module materials. And if you have any questions or you want me to look over anything, by all means you can contact me and ask questions, and I'll be glad to work with you on it. So that's it for this week. Now you'll go forth for the rest of the module materials, and have a good one.